Hi.
Hi, everybody. Or Megan, Ivany.
Thanks for coming. We're going to start doing this monthly, and so we're hoping eventually people will have some more questions for us and we can answer them online. So for now, what we did was we made a quick slideshow, which is backwards.
It's backwards. You know what the problem is? We couldn't Chromecast, so we've been having technical issues this morning after running this through a couple times. That's okay. We'll still just make it work.
Yeah, and we will share the slides so that you don't have to look at them backwards after.
Okay,
All
so
right.
we're talking about reinforcement this month. We posted a few things both on the RBT community and the ABA training Google Plus community so that you can understand reinforcement better and have an opportunity to ask questions. We did get a few really good questions that came in through email.
Yeah.
So, and questions that are sort of common as we're moving through school. So we're going to cover some of those after we talk about reinforcement in general.
Okay. So
if you have questions, Megan, you can type them in the chat box.
Or anyone else who may be here.
Yeah, who's not showing up yet.
Actually, it says we have 22 viewers.
Oh, yay!
Oh, 2. I don't know. I'm not really sure. We'll have to learn how that goes. Okay. So what is reinforcement? We often hear reinforcement being confused with the reward. And so we want to make sure that that's clear that it's not the same thing. So just because something is really fun or it's a preference for you doesn't mean that you would work for it. And that's a reinforcer. A reinforcer is something that's delivered right after the behavior that is going to make the behavior stronger in the end. So I have a little picture here of a bridge to try to help you remember that a bridge being reinforced by the pillars makes it stronger. So reinforcement makes a behavior stronger.
So really you have to think about not what you tried to reward the student with, but what actually was effective in allowing that student to repeat that behavior again, whether it be a positive or a negative behavior. With behavior, we always want to look at what happened afterward. And did it in fact make it stronger or did it make it weaker? We have to be able to know that before we then look at our reinforcement system.
And the reason we don't want to confuse it with a reward is because a reward is really seen as something positive, but something delivered, for example, possibly yelling at someone could be functioning as a reinforcer if it makes that behavior stronger in the end.
Right.
All right. So next, we have our ABCs. So when you're collecting your ABC charts, the reinforcement's always going to fall under the C part of your ABC charts. And that is whatever happened immediately after the behavior.
So when you look at your antecedent might be that you show the student a first then board and say, first math and then iPad. The behavior is they complete the math and the consequence is you deliver the iPad. You don't really know if that iPad actually functioned as a reinforcer unless next time you show them the first then board that says first math, then iPad. Do they do it? Are they not only doing it, but very excited to do it, meaning they know the reinforcement contingency and they're banking on it happening. That's actually when you know if it was a reinforcer, not just by simply delivering it at the end and the student might play with it. So reinforcement is not in just looking at one set of ABCs, it's actually looking at the next set. And as your next antecedent happens, okay, was he reinforced? Well, we're going to find out next time we present the first then board. So think about that because oftentimes what happens is in the A column, you might say first math and then iPad. The behavior is the student completes the math. And in the C column, they don't take the iPad or they want something else. That was not a reward, but it also wasn't, it's not likely going to function as a reinforcer. The other thing that sometimes happens is, he likes the iPad, right? So in the A column, you say first math and then iPad. Well, it doesn't evoke the behavior of doing the worksheet. And then you might have some problem behavior instead. So your desired behavior doesn't happen and your undesirable behavior does happen. And so you can't deliver that, what you were hoping to be a reinforcer. So when we're looking at our ABC contingency, the reinforcement comes in the C column, but we have to make sure we're looking at next time, did it work well enough for our student to function as a reinforcer?
And sometimes the promise of a reinforcer does function as a reinforcer. So something like a tangible, if you said first math and then iPad, for example, and it wasn't the iPad they wanted and they chose a book, for example, the promise of that reinforcer can become a reinforcer in the end because just knowing that something good to them is coming, as long as you're willing to be flexible especially with our kids with a little bit more of a fleeting MO. So they're not necessarily liking the same thing over and over.
By fleeting MO, Marilyn means what we call in behavior analysis motivating operations. So you RBTers out there will understand what we're saying here. But basically, MO is motivation.
So fleeting MO just basically means that one time they may love it, the next time they may not, and then they might like it again the next time. So we're constantly kind of doing preference assessments to make sure that we have ample opportunities to give them reinforcement.
Yep.
All right. So next we're going to talk about the difference between positive and negative reinforcement. And so we have a little diagram here that says before, so Johnny has no Coke in his glass. There's a behavior. He asks for some Coke. So he says, "Can I have some Coke, please?" And then Johnny has Coke. So it's positive reinforcement because something is added. So something is added in the C column, which makes it more likely for him to do this. If Johnny continues to ask for Coke when he has no Coke in his glass, then getting the Coke becomes a reinforcer. But it's positive because it was added to.
Yep. So reinforcement is when a behavior is increased, and positive is something added. So always think positive reinforcement is added something, and reinforcement means it made the behavior happen again. So that's always sort of a simple way to think about positive reinforcement, is that you have to add something.
And for you RBTers out there, you'll see the little R with the plus. So that's your positive reinforcement. And that's kind of a short form for it, but it's just another way to help you remember that that is something added to it. So the opposite is true for negative reinforcement. So something being removed in the C column that functions as a reinforcer is negative reinforcement. So for this example, their hands were wet. Behavior was drying your hands with a towel, and afterwards your hands are no longer wet. So the wetness is gone, and so that was removed, and that becomes a positive reinforcer. So therefore, next time when your hands are wet, you're more likely to dry them with the towel in order to get them dry.
So the reinforcer here is the drying of the hands. That is, in fact, a reinforcer. So
the removal, so minus, of something wet on your hands.
That's right. So just like positive reinforcement is a plus, think about negative reinforcement as a minus. You're taking something away that will increase the likelihood of that behavior again. This is a really tricky one. And on the RBT Google Plus community, we do have videos that outline everyday examples in schools that we've seen and that you've seen, that outline examples of positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, positive punishment, negative punishment, which we won't get into today, but we do have those videos to help support really that understanding of positive, negative, because sometimes what happens is we often hear people say, I'm just trying to use positive reinforcement by shutting off the music when the student cries. That's actually negative reinforcement because you're taking away the music when the student cries. So, and it's really important to know the difference, and it's important to know which one you're using, because we want to use positive reinforcement as much as we can. And we want to be able to look at those A, B, C contingencies and see how we can change the A. So we don't want to get into the habit of having to always use negative reinforcement to shut off a behavior, basically. We want to be able to look at the A column to prevent that behavior. So sometimes it's very important to know the difference and know which one you are using.
And it's important as well not to confuse negative reinforcement with punishment. So punishment and negative reinforcement often go together, and I believe it's the word negative that kind of puts them together. And what we want to remember is negative reinforcement is the removal, but positive punishment is addition of something. So you're adding something and it decreases the behavior. Whereas negative reinforcement, you remove something to increase the behavior. So we want to make sure that we don't confuse the two as well. Often, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was going to say often we're negatively reinforced. So this is where the contingency really comes into play. We're negatively reinforced by the removal of something negative in the classroom. So for example, a child is yelling really loud in the classroom and he's removed. We're negatively reinforced because the removal of him actually maybe made our class more able to teach the class, for example. So we are more likely in the future to remove that child because we're able to then teach the class. So we have to look at our own behavior too when we're looking at negative reinforcement.
That's right. Because if you're negatively reinforced, it's going to increase your behavior in the future by removal of something. But of course, we know that that's not a good solution. That's not a long-term answer.
Possibly positively reinforcing the student.
Yeah. And people say, why am I so likely to react that way, right? And that's when we explain negative reinforcement. So, for example, I'm driving yesterday and I'm listening to my daughter's favorite song, which is from the Moana soundtrack. And she's singing so loud. So when I say to her, sing a little quieter, mommy has a headache, she did not sing a little quieter. When I yelled, Hannah, you have to stop singing, mommy has a headache, she stopped. So I yelled at my daughter to decrease her behavior. So that is positive punishment. I've added something, which is my yelling, to decrease her behavior. And so sometimes when we get into these patterns of behavior, it helps to understand what exactly is happening and why we continue to do those patterns of behavior. And, stepping away from the situation and thinking about it in those terms helps me better be able to set up antecedents next time so that I only put on the Moana soundtrack when I don't have a headache.
So Hannah was positively punished because the addition of the yelling made the behavior stop. But Jen was negatively reinforced because her behavior, which was yelling, made the singing go away. So there's often those two contingencies go together. The punishment with negative reinforcement, they go together, or positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement often go together as well.
Yeah.
All right, so we were going to come up with some examples of positive and negative reinforcement. Do you guys have any? We have hi, Minnow, you're here too.
Hello. Feel free to be brave and give us the scenario, and we'll help you work through it if you're not quite sure if it's positive or negative reinforcement.
So we can give you an example, and maybe you guys can help us answer them. So, for example, I am in a classroom, I'm the student, and I don't like that someone beside me is talking, maybe. So Jen is talking, I hit Jen, and Jen stops talking. Is my behavior positively reinforced or negatively reinforced? Come on, Megan.
So let's break it down.
Yeah.
She hit me, so she added something to the situation. She added, and did it decrease or increase the likelihood of that behavior? Positive punishment. Okay, so she added something to me that decreased the future likelihood of my talking.
Right, and so my behavior, so Jen's behavior, you're right, it was positive punishment. But for me, am I more likely to yell at someone next time? Or am I more likely to try something different? It worked for me. So my behavior was negatively reinforced, right? Because I did a behavior and that behavior or Jen's behavior went away. So there was a negative reinforcement there. So next time
she took away my talking, which will increase the likelihood of her hitting or yelling at me next time, because she's been negatively reinforced. So we know that the pattern of Marilyn's behavior, she's going to keep hitting me.
Yes.
And we know the pattern of my behavior is that...
Oh, no, Megan, you were right. We were just talking about different behaviors. No, absolutely right.
Yeah. So it's important always to think about who the behavior is. So in the RBT coursework, they probably covered this, where they talk about, is the behavior Jen or is the behavior Marilyn, and which one are we actually talking about? So we didn't make that clear.
Yeah.
So you were right that you were talking about me and my behavior.
Absolutely. Yeah. So often we will see if a child is yelling or hitting another child, we remove the child who's being yelled or hit because we're worried for the safety of that child. However, what it ends up doing often is reinforcing the child who was doing the yelling or the hitting if the removal of that child was a reinforcer. Does that make sense? So what we want to try to do is, if we see that situation happening, of course, we're going to remove them in the moment, but then thinking for next time, we want to put antecedent strategies in place so that this doesn't happen. So we could say something, for example, of, if you want someone to go away, you can just ask in a nice voice or something along those lines, so that we reinforce the positive behavior of saying go away versus the behavior of hitting or yelling.
So I'm thinking of using this reinforcement with my own kiddos. So I have a 3-year-old and a 6-year-old. The 6-year-old is in a phase right now where she likes to post signs on her door, no 3-year-olds allowed, things like that. It's really cute. Sometimes it's no moms or dads allowed or no dogs allowed. And so when my 3-year-old Charlotte manages to break her way in there, I will hear screaming, "Mom, she's in my room, Mom, she's in my room." And Charlotte will usually start crying, "Hannah won't let me in her room." And so if I go up there and I just remove Charlotte, then Hannah has been reinforced, right? Because her yelling and screaming and putting up don't enter signs has been reinforced because I've removed something. So it's been negatively reinforced. She's going to keep doing that behavior because I removed what needed to be removed. And so thinking about that for next time as an antecedent, I could set up Charlotte with activities that are going to make her less likely to go into Hannah's room. But I could also teach Hannah, when Charlotte's in your room, come and find mommy right away. Ask me in a nice, calm voice to help you, and I will come and help you. And if I want that type of behavior to increase, then I have to start really teaching her that that's the way and heavily reinforcing it. So even if I'm in the middle of folding laundry, in the middle of loading the dishwasher, in the middle of my favorite show, in the middle of my master's course, if she asks for my help, I've got to get to her right away, because what kids learn is these negative behaviors of yelling or screaming get reinforced much faster than the appropriate behaviors, and much more frequently than the appropriate behaviors. Because how often does it happen where someone says, "Hey, I need some help"? You might say, "Just hold on, just wait." But if they're screaming, then you run. So,
and not only do you run, but dad runs and everyone else in the house runs.
The dog runs.
Yeah, everyone runs.
Running. Yeah. And so when we're looking at patterns of behavior, we have to look at, in the A column, in that antecedent column, what are we going to teach, everybody involved to make that situation go smoothly? And we have to make sure we're reinforcing it heavily in order for it to happen again. So yeah, that's the tough part.
Yeah, it is tough. Okay. So
hopefully you guys can see this. Sorry,
we'll post the slides as well.
Chromecast was not working.
Okay, so what this slide says is, what does the function of behavior have to do with reinforcement? So basically what we want to make sure is that we're always identifying the function of behavior before we're even putting a reinforcement system in place. And you're probably thinking, why? Like, I can just reinforce every kid. Well, the problem is what we just explained. We don't want to accidentally positively punish or negatively reinforce a behavior because we're not actually sure what's reinforcing the behavior. So we're going to talk about sensory, escape, attention, and tangible for a moment, and how reinforcement comes into play.
Okay.
I don't know. We were kind of going back and forth.
So
looking at you.
Yeah. So we're going to talk about escape. So this is what it says here. The antecedent is that it's time to do a math worksheet. The behavior is that Ben throws the math worksheet on the floor and runs out of the room. Everybody out there can attest to having seen this and experienced this. And the consequence is Ben is taken for a walk. So we see this all the time. This ABC contingency is nothing new.
Yeah.
Of course, when we start looking at the common A's, he's in a demand condition. Someone's told him to do work. The common C's is that he's taken for a walk. Sometimes we call these body breaks. And when they're in the C column, we always want to be careful. Are you reinforcing escape? So we know the function is likely escape here. So he knows that his past patterns of behavior have taught him that, hey, when I'm in a demand condition, and I throw things on the floor, I will likely be either delayed for that demand. So even if they end up coming back to the math, he knows it successfully delays it every time, or remove it altogether. Maybe you go for a walk and then, well, look at that, it's gym time now. So we join gym.
Yeah.
So removing Ben for a walk is reinforcement. Even though we say we didn't give him a reward, we hear this all the time. We didn't give him a reward. I promise. I didn't tell him he was great. I didn't praise him for it. I didn't do any of the things that we typically sort of stereotypically associate with the word reinforcement, but you did reinforce him. How do we know this? Well, when you continue to track your data, it's going to be very predictable that next time he's in a demand condition, not always necessarily with a math worksheet, but in certain demand conditions,
unpreferred condition,
you're going to be able to predict that he's going to throw it on the floor or reject it in some way and bolt. And how do we know that? Because he's been getting reinforcement. So remember, every time you remove something and you and it keeps happening in the future, it means it in fact was reinforcement. So therefore, this will increase the behavior of throwing and running and make it stronger. So think of that bridge. Every time he acts this way and you take him for a walk afterward, you're adding concrete to the bottom of that bridge. And the more the more you strengthen that behavior, the harder it actually is to change. So
it is still, you still can change it. So we don't want to make you think that you can't change it, but we do want to say that the more it's reinforced, the stronger it becomes. So like the concrete example, I like that.
Yeah.
And it'll be harder to change it.
So what you want to do here is think about, if Ben really likes walks, you want to move it into your A column. Okay, bud, you're going to do one math question. Make it small, make it measurable, make it doable, make it manageable. And then we're going to take a walk. And then you're going to heavily support that, do the math question. And it doesn't really matter if it's a can't do or a won't do. If he can't do it because it's too hard, you support him. If it's a won't, and you're thinking, I know he can do this. He's done it a million times. He knows this math. Doesn't matter. Either way, you want to make sure the reinforcement is there, because when something is a can't do, we're really good as a system in supporting the educational things that need to be modified, or
the proper prompts to put in place.
Yeah, we know how to support our students. When it's a won't do, that's where we're not as strong yet of how to support our students, because it means they need behavioral support. They don't need the academic support. And so either way, whether you're not sure if it's a can't or a won't, or you're convinced it's one or the other, it's okay, because moving some strategies into your A column will help. First, do one question, which I will help you with, and then we can take a quick walk. Good. And then you come back really quick. You don't want the walk to be 20 minutes, because sometimes when we take data on how long kids are walking in halls, it's a little bit scary. So quick walk, come back. Okay, let's work on the second question. Go for a walk. If the student is reinforced by walking, which we know in his behavioral history he is, we don't need to think about, can we reinforce him with tech? Can we reinforce him with toys? Can we reinforce him with all this stuff? He's already told us through problem behavior exactly what he finds reinforcing. We just need to use it to our advantage to evoke a behavior that we want to see.
Yeah, so now we're reinforcing the new behavior, which is did one math question, versus the behavior of throwing the paper on the floor for the exact same reinforcer, but we're just changing the behavior in the middle.
Yep. Yeah. And start small and build up, and give yourself permission to start small. A lot of times people feel like, I've got this student in my class and I feel the weight of the world because I've got to change all of his behaviors and get him ready for the next grade. And you know, you have all of these pressures on you. But if you just start small and you know you're working in the right direction, then you're more likely to, one, go slow and take your students' lead at the pace that they can go. But you're also more likely to kind of give yourself a break and not rush it and not feel so stressed about it. So,
and I had a chat with a teacher the other day who was saying, but he'll only do one question or maybe two questions by the time that the block's over. And I said, well, when he was running out of the room, was he doing any? And they said, nope. So now we have one or two, and we can build our way up from there, but we still have more than what was previously being completed. So yeah, don't be afraid to give yourself permission to slow down a little bit. All right, so now we have an example for attention. So if your A column is transitioning between classes, your B column is Ziggy yells across the hall that Debbie has ugly hair. And the teacher intervenes and talks to Ziggy about the problem behavior. So say we're seeing this multiple times every day, right? So afterwards, maybe we're saying we can't talk like that, or maybe we're saying you need to apologize, whatever it is. There's definitely some attention coming from the teacher. So if we're seeing that in between classes, he's possibly not getting as much attention, there's a transition, maybe there's no one-on-one at that point, or maybe there's just no one around, he exhibits a behavior and he gets lots of attention. If we continue to see this pattern, then we're going to say that the function is likely attention. So talking to Ziggy afterwards is actually a reinforcer. Why? Because he was looking for attention and he got it. Our brains don't know the difference between positive and negative attention. Jen and I talk about this a lot. It's not like we're seeking one form of attention. We are just seeking attention. And so this will increase Ziggy's behavior of calling people names or bullying people because this behavior is being reinforced. So what would we do? We would change that. We would put the C column into the A column. Right before a transition, give him lots of juicy, a little bit of one-on-one attention. Then when he goes into the hallway, we're not as likely to see this attention-seeking behavior. And then we can reinforce him again with some attention at the end of the transition. So really what we want to always do is when our C is reinforcing a negative behavior, we move it to our A and we prevent that behavior from happening in the first place, and then we see new behavior that we can also reinforce.
So sometimes you can think about different ways to provide that attention. Sometimes it's from the teacher saying, hey, Ziggy, how's it going, bud? you did great today with raising your hand or whatever, or it was awesome that you came to class on time. If it's an older student, whatever you feel like you want to give some attention around, that's great. Sometimes you need to go one step further and add an additional source of reinforcement. So you could say, would you mind carrying this to Mrs. Brown on your way to the next class? Give them a little bit of a distractor, but also they know that more attention's coming because you've told Mrs. Brown ahead of time. When Ziggy brings you the random ABA book, because obviously everyone's got ABA books. When Ziggy brings you the ABA book, can you just make sure you really lay it on thick that you really appreciated it? Because you're giving lots of attention, you're giving them a specific task that ends in a lot of attention. And so that's things you can do that are small things. They're not going to take a whole lot of your time. They take a bit of planning ahead of time. But once you kind of get into the flow of that, it can be a really beautiful thing.
And often for an example like this, people will say, well, am I not supposed to talk to him if it did happen the first time? What we would suggest doing if this actually happened is giving lots of attention to the victim. And by the victim being the person who got called ugly in this situation, because they're the person who actually needs the attention right now. And we don't deal with it right now, but we can talk to Ziggy at a later time. But we want to make sure that we don't do it immediately after the behavior, because that's when it will reinforce it. It likely won't reinforce it at the same level if you talk to him at 2 o'clock and it happened at 10 a.m. But again, we don't want to think we want to think preventatively, so preventing this behavior. But we often do get that question about what do we do if it happens right now? Mm-hmm. And so that is attention to the victim and deal with it at a later time.
And think about how much we need attention in our lives, right? It's one of the very first functions that we learn to do effectively and appropriately most times. Think about, I always use the laundry basket example. When, you're on mat leave and you've got a 3-month-old and you're carrying your laundry basket by and your baby tracks you across the room, you go, hey babe, hi, it's mommy. Yep, I'm folding up your clothes. Your baby has gotten some positive reinforcement, meaning something was added, which was mommy going, oh my gosh, you're so adorable over there. Reinforcement meaning they're more likely to track you across the room in the future because they got the attention that they needed, right? And so that's why babies often start to cry and then is replaced by certain behaviors, looking at you, smiling at you, cooing at you, which is then replaced by language, right? Saying mama, saying dada. The reason why babies say those words is because it's heavily reinforced. Picture yourself the first time your baby said mama and dada to you. You had a pretty big reaction. Yeah. So, some of our students have just developed maladaptive behaviors to seek attention for so many different reasons that it could be setting event related. They're not getting a lot of positive attention. Sometimes negative attention is the only way they know to get attention because they just don't have a repertoire of behavior of appropriate ways to get attention. They may, a lot of our kiddos with ASD, for example, have huge deficits in social interaction. So they don't know an appropriate way, or they're slow to evoke those behaviors or slower to evoke those positive behaviors. And it's just easier to smack you across the head because you're going to look at me, for sure you're going to look at me. And so if that's
bigger bang for your buck, right?
Yeah, so if that's my learned history is that I want her attention and this seems to do it, I'm going to keep doing it. And of course, then if everybody adds more and more and more attention to that, that's a problem. So for Ziggy's victim here, who's been called ugly, giving her the attention in the moment is really the best consequence strategy if you had to use one. So.
Yep.
Okay, we've got tangible here. The antecedent is Jack and Jill are playing with dolls on a hill. I don't know. The behavior is Jill asked Jack for a car for the dolls. So picture this, Jack and Jill are together playing with the dolls. Jill says, hey, Jack, can I have a car? Jack gives Jill the car. So when you're looking at the common A's is that they're socially interacting, and Jill doesn't have a car. She only has the dolls. The common C's is that after she asks, she's often given a car. So we know the function of this is tangible. And again, going back to the ASD example, a lot of times when you don't have a lot of language or social skills, it's harder to evoke this appropriate behavior of just saying, hey, Jack, can I have a car? So you have to look at giving Jill the car was in fact reinforcement. So picture this. How we would know if it wasn't reinforcement is if Jack and Jill are playing with the dolls. Jill says, hey, Jack, can I have a car? Jack gives her the car and Jill says, hey, Jack, can I have a car? Jack, can I get a car? And so that didn't reinforce her. Why? Because that didn't make her behavior stop. She kept asking for a car. So that's kind of a silly example because that doesn't really happen. Why? Because this is the way that behavior flows. It shuts it off when it's reinforced. So we always know that in a tangible situation, we have to make sure this behavior is very strong. And with a lot of times that means a lot of priming, which we do talk about a lot on our RBT community. And we've posted, I think, 1 or maybe 2 videos on the ABA community about priming. But we can't just say to kids, hey, Jill, if you wanted a car, just ask Jack, okay? Because sure, neurotypical kids might take that prompt and might remember that in the moment. But a lot of times that's just not the case. We need actual practice. Our brains need the rehearsal over and over and over again in those situations. So if Jill is someone who typically has a hard time asking or doesn't remember the words, or her elicited response is smacking people in the head to get the car, then we need to make sure we practice a lot with her. You might sit with her a few times a day and you've got the car and you might prompt her, ask me for the car.
Can I have the car?
Sure. Well, you asked me for the car in a safe situation that doesn't involve other peers, so that you can practice. Let's practice it again. I take the car back and I say, try again. Can I have the car? Yeah, you asked for the car. Oh, good job. Okay, sweetheart, I want you to try with a friend. And then you go, you put the car, you contrive it, right? You have to contrive these learning opportunities. You go give the cars to a friend, have her walk over there, ask Jack appropriately for the car. You tell Jack ahead of time, when she comes to ask for the car, but I want you to be so good at sharing. He gives her the car. And this is the kind of exercise that takes a minute, 2 minutes, but if you set it up throughout the day, it's going to go a long way. And this is the kind of priming you need in these tangible situations for sure.
And that's why we gave an example that wasn't a problem behavior. And the reason for that is we want you to realize that everything you do throughout the day is reinforced, or you will stop doing it. So for example, you go to the grocery store, you pay for something, you get your groceries. You will do that every time because you know that that will have you leave with the groceries. And so everything you do throughout the day is reinforced. We didn't want everything to be focused on on problem behavior and how we're going to change that, but everything you do and everything your kids do. So this is how language is developed. When language is motivating for us, so we understand that there's a function to it, we continue to use it. And so if this child possibly was having difficulties with language versus difficulties with sharing, maybe asking for the car was actually, in fact, teaching her that new language of, you say car, you get the item, versus a sharing example, which it could have been either. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, and that's what we call manding. So in applied behavior analysis, or behavior analysis in general, there are verbal operants, which I believe you learned a little bit about in your RBT course, at least sort of what they are: manding, tacting, interverbals, things like that. So manding is something we're actually working heavily in our assessment classes around manding, because our students that don't have a lot of language to access tangibles, that really is the number one thing we want to develop when we're looking at the behavior of language. And like Marilyn said, the function of language. A lot of students who have echolalia, for example, will echo random TV shows or words or sing songs repetitively. So they're very much verbal. They just don't know that that language has a function or a purpose, and when we can teach them that, that's a super powerful tool. That's really a critical communication skill, to know that when I want something, these words that I've been saying, that's something that I can use to get what I need. So I love it.
And kids with typical kids with when they're developing their language, they definitely when they're learning, they get reinforced by multiple things. So they get reinforced by the tangibles that are provided. They get reinforced by all of our attention that we give them as young children when they're starting to produce language. And sometimes our non-neurotypical kids, they're not necessarily reinforced by that attention. So that language doesn't develop over time. So that it's not as socially significant for them when they're younger. So we want to make sure that we're really teaching them when we're starting with this, with the tangible items, so that they're really understanding I say, I get, I say, I get.
Yeah.
And the same goes for sign or PECS or any augmented communication system.
Yeah. And we have videos about manding on the Google Plus community. You can feel free to review.
And more to come, because it's a constant thing we talk about. Okay, last but not least, we have sensory. So this was a little more difficult to find an example, because it was difficult to find an example of something that was solely the function of sensory. So what we came up with was playing soccer in the gym was the antecedent. And the behavior was Louis takes a drink of water, and the consequence was Louis puts the water away and keeps playing soccer. So we assume that his thirst has now been quenched. And so that function would be sensory. So him taking a drink made the thirst go away. And we only can say that he put the water away and he continued to play. And we assume that he no longer needs water because of that. We can't say he's no longer thirsty because we don't know that. So we can only describe what we see. But Louis playing soccer made him more likely to be thirsty, and therefore reinforcement was drinking that water. It made him not thirsty anymore. And so next time when he feels that feeling in his mouth or he's out of breath, he'll more likely to drink water because that made him feel better to continue to play soccer.
So when we're talking about behavior change, what we always want to do is see how we can change the A to either increase the behavior or decrease the behavior. So if we want Louis to drink more water, we can either have him play soccer more frequently. We can deprive him of water right before the soccer game. Yeah. We can flavor the water to make it more reinforcing to him. There are things that we can do to increase his water drinking behavior. If for some reason we wanted to decrease his water drinking behavior during the game, maybe you're the coach and you're saying, he's always running to drink water and I need him on the field. He's our best player. Then we want to make sure we are satiating him on water right before he goes out there. Drink all you can, bud, and run to the bathroom real quick. Then get out there on the field. He's less likely to need as much water during the game. Yeah. So there's different things we can do in the A column to increase or decrease behavior depending on what our goal is.
Right.
But that's a good sensory example.
Oops, wrong way, sorry. So the function of the behavior tells us what they want, why the behavior is happening. So if we know what the function is, we also know what a possible reinforcer is. So if we know that the function of behavior is attention and they're trying to get attention, that's what we can provide as a reinforcer. So the same goes for tangible and the same goes for escape. So for the walk example, they rewarded him with escape, which was the walk, which was no longer doing the work, versus rewarding the problem behavior with that same function.
And sometimes people say, I have a hard time finding a reinforcer for my kiddo. Like a lot of times we hear this. And we just have some quick tricks about that. We have potential reinforcer profiles that we can have parents fill out and school staff fill out. And it goes through auditory reinforcers, kinetic reinforcers, tangible, like edible reinforcers, all kinds of different reinforcers. And you can rate them sort of from strongly reinforcing to moderately reinforcing to not at all to aversive even. And so when you're using a tool like that, it does a couple things. One, it kind of gives you a quick inventory, but it also kind of lets you test things that are outside the box. So for example, I dropped off one of these reinforcements tools at a classroom recently, and the teacher said, I wouldn't have even thought to try a couple of these things, right? Like I didn't.
And the links are in here, so you'll
the links are in here, so you can have copies of those and try them out. But another quick trick we usually use is we'll say, if you could let them do anything they want right now for half an hour, what would it be? And so sometimes it's the light bulb moment. For example, again, in a class last week, I asked a teacher, what would he do? Because the student, she said, he doesn't have a lot that reinforces him or a lot of motivators that we can try to use as reinforcers, right? And so I said, great, what would he do if you could let him do anything you wanted? She said, watch the grade 5s and 6s come in off the yard. I said, you've got a reinforcer. You can use that. Yeah. You can make that contingent on a target behavior. And now you've got to be careful of the timing because you got to figure out when are they coming off the yard and what can you get your kiddo to do right before that. And as a reinforcer, let's go watch the big kids coming off the yard. And that's such a great social thing. We can turn that into high fives as the kids come in. We can turn that into good morning. We can really work with that. And that's a beautiful thing. But if you're just thinking of reinforcers as stuff to give them, which is often the sort of trap we fall into, then you're going to be limited. So you want to make sure you're using different tools and tricks to figure out what could be reinforcers.
Another question I ask sometimes is, if I gave you $1 million, what would you do to shut that behavior off right now? And they'll be like, oh, I just tell him not to do the math. I'm like, great, you have your reinforcer then. It's one quick question and then no more math. Or, oh, I would just sit there and talk to him about his whole weekend and about his whole week. Great, you have your reinforcer, it's attention. So whatever would shut that behavior off is also, well, it is the function, but it's also what would function as a reinforcer for them.
Right.
And another thing to remember when you're talking about your reinforcers, I had this chat yesterday, is we don't want to augment their reinforcers. So whatever it is, and if you choose that that's something that is viable and you would give it to them, then that's what it is, and we're going to give it to them. So for example, I have a little girl who really likes a little plastic hanger, and she just kind of likes to look at it and stare at it and skim on it. And they said, well, we don't really want to give her that as a reinforcer because it's not socially appropriate. And I said, well, for now, we need her to do this. So we're going to give her that, and we're going to shape that into something more appropriate. So, eventually we might find some other things she can dangle, and then we'll play with her and turn that into a song, and then maybe make it more social. But for right now, that's what she likes. We also had another little boy who was playing on an iPad. So he wanted to work for the iPad, but they were limiting what he could work for on the iPad. But all he wanted to do was look at all the calendar years. Just for an hour, I wanted to look at all the calendar years. So and I said, go for it. Like, this is not dangerous. This is not hurting anybody. And that's his thing. And we all have our things, right? You open your phone. Some people go right to Instagram. Some people go right to email. But we all have our different things that we look at. And no one is coming over and saying, you know what? It's not Facebook time. It's iPad time. Or it's email time, right? So we want to make sure that whatever we're giving them, that if we're willing to give it to them, that we're not limiting it.
And we also have to be careful. Sometimes we talk about killing the EO, meaning you've killed his motivation for it. How did you do that? Well, you promised him, first we're going to walk inside, and then you're going to get the toy. And then when he gets inside, you kind of think, oh my gosh, he's doing it. He's doing it. Okay, no, take off your shoes and hang up your coat, because you just want to add in some extra instructions before he gets the reinforcer. You're going to kill his motivation. So what happens in that case is the demand becomes too great, or too many demands to make that reinforcer worth it anymore. He was willing to do it when the deal was, I come inside and I get it. That's the contingency that you promised. That's the contingency you have to deliver. If I come inside and then I have to do a whole bunch of other stuff before I get it, then it really quickly becomes a game of, is it worth it? Maybe it's not. So we have to be careful. We call that ratio strain, when the expectations become too great for the level of reinforcement. And we all have that. I mean, you have a contingency with the OCSB. You come to work, you get paid. You come to work, you get paid. That's a clear contingency to you and a clear contingency to the board. And that's why that works on both sides. If more and more and more and more is expected of you, and it's like,
you have to work every weekend for the same amount of pay.
Yeah, 80 hours a week, 100 hours a week, less pay, all these things. Everyone's going to have their point where it's just not worth it anymore, right? And so when we think about our kids and their reinforcement system, sometimes we hear things like, well, I don't get reinforcement, or I just want him to love learning. I want him to love reading. My girlfriend said this to me last night, can you help me? I just want her to love reading. And I said, you can't just make her love it. You've got to pair it with great things and reinforce it heavily. Yeah. And then it will transfer to intrinsic love of reading. But right now she doesn't know how to spell or sound out the word. So we've got to get her there slowly. And recognize that that's okay to add reinforcement. It's okay to use reinforcement, and know that the end goal is trying to transfer some of these things to intrinsic. But the other kids aren't there yet.
Yeah, no, you're right. And the other, Jen gave me an idea there, is another thing we do sometimes that satiates us, or really, really makes that MO go away, is we talk to them during their reinforcement. So for example, say you said, here, Marilyn, you can have your phone and you can play Facebook for 5 minutes, but you talk to me the whole time. I wouldn't be able to actually get into what I'm doing, and therefore I would not feel reinforced, because that wasn't actually a break. It's like at home where my husband will say, why don't you go take a break for 25 minutes? And then he calls me 3 times about what's happening. Not a break. If you're watching.
Jaden already out there.
So yeah, we want to make sure that whatever they're actually working for, that we give it to them in that context as well. So do they want to sit quietly? Maybe they do want us. Maybe they want to play with us. And that's often another thing. They're like, oh, I can't sit with him. And I'm like, well, the reinforcer is him actually sitting with you and playing the iPad versus just having the iPad. So we need to look at the whole part of the reinforcer.
Yeah. And it's okay to give them that time. So sometimes it's so natural to turn everything into a teaching moment. So when he's playing with his reinforcer, like, what color is it? And what shape is this? And look at this. And that's all just demands. And I'm not going to work for a reinforcer that has a whole bunch of demands tied to it. I'm just not. So it's okay to give him that break, and then use that really good teaching time in times where he's actually supposed to be learning and not supposed to be enjoying a reinforcer, for sure.
Yeah. All right. Okay. So what should you do? So basically what we did is we outlined each function here and what you could do to make sure that your reinforcers are going to be effective. So, To reduce behavior, you're going to replace the behavior with an appropriate behavior. So for example, rather than grabbing, you're going to say, you need to ask for it. You're going to prompt that behavior immediately, and you're going to reinforce it immediately. Yes, we want to fade our prompts, but right now we want to make sure that we prompt so that they are going to be successful immediately. What we don't want is, Jen, stand up. Jen, stand up. Okay, don't stand up.
Okay.
Jen, stand up. Jen, stand up. Jen, stand up. Right? We want to prompt them immediately. So the quicker we say it, the quicker they do it, the quicker they access reinforcement. That makes that a lot faster for them to learn, and they don't have to wait for all that prompting in between, which actually has them I'm just laughing at you standing so quickly.
So compliant.
You're so compliant. We want to make sure that we prompt immediately so they access that reinforcer immediately. Don't worry that you're prompting too much. We would rather you prompt too much the first time and fade it quickly than not prompt enough and then they're not able to be successful.
So oftentimes people will say, why doesn't he ever listen? Or why, he just ignores me. And so what we'll often say is, well, let me take some quick data on that. And so every time you give an instruction, I might make a tick on a piece of paper, tick, 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 tick. And then I write a P when finally a prompt came that actually got him to do the task. And sometimes looking at that data and saying, okay, on average, you ask him to do things 4 times before you actually prompt him. So what you've inadvertently done is taught him that
he has to only listen on the 5th time.
That's right.
Yeah. So to teach a new skill, it's very similar. Instead of replacing the skill, we're just going to prompt the skill that we want. We're going to provide immediate reinforcement. And again, we're going to plan to fade those prompts. We always want to plan to fade our prompts so that they don't end up being prompt dependent. And remember, a child being prompt dependent is our fault, not theirs, because we have not faded our prompts. They can't do that for us. So we have linked you to our potential reinforcement assessment. So this was, Jen was talking about that it's basically a list 2 or 3 pages long of just potential ideas. And it's really helpful because sometimes you just forget what type of things you could actually use. Teachers have read it before and been like, oh, I never have thought of that. And I do the same thing. Sometimes I even look at it with my own kids. I'm like, oh, that'd be a great idea to do. So it's a really great way to think of some ideas. Next, you want to connect a preference assessment. So we've put a link here on how to do it, I guess it's the data sheet on how to do it. And we also have videos on the Google and RBT on conducting a preference assessment. Yeah. And then the last but not least is the reinforcer assessment. So the difference between a preference and reinforcement assessment are on this chart, and I'll get Jen to explain it to you a little because she made this beautiful chart for you guys. So
this chart, basically, it's on the RBT community. I'm trying to think if it's also on the ABA community. If not, we'll throw it up there, and you will share the slide deck. But basically, a preference assessment is just seeing what the student likes versus what they don't really care much about. So I might offer both of these things to Marilyn and see which one she wants. Okay, so she prefers the iPhone to the water. It doesn't mean she's good. This is a reinforcer. It just means it's a preference. So that's a huge difference. So just because a student will take something because you've offered it or take something over something else, it doesn't mean it's going to function as a reinforcer. She might prefer this to water, but it doesn't mean she's going to do my laundry to get it, right? So, I mean, I don't know, I could test it out because I've got a pile, but we want to make sure that as a reinforcer, what I'm going to do is, okay, this was her preference. Now I'm going to say, complete this pile of folding laundry to get this, complete this pile of folding laundry to get this. Which one do you pick? And she might say, okay, I'll fold the laundry for the phone. Now we're talking reinforcement. She's willing to make it contingent on some work. And that's when we're talking reinforcement. So sometimes a preference assessment can help you pick the top few things you want to try, but don't assume they're reinforcers because they may not be.
And also don't assume it's a reinforcer just because they tell you it's one. So I'll give the example of my kids right now. We're working on one call when they go to bed. This is because we could have bedtime for 2.5 hours. And so they were picking things, and especially my 5-year-old.
One call meaning it's when your kid goes to bed and says, Mommy, I need a drink. Mommy, I'm still hungry. Mommy, I need one more hug.
Right, because it was just going on forever. So we were like, you get one call and then it's time for bed. And so my daughter, my 5-year-old, who is quite sneaky, was choosing a cookie every morning. And I was like, okay. And she'd still have 17 calls. And then in the morning I'd say, well, you don't get your cookie. And she was like, okay. Because she didn't care about the cookie. She was smart enough to have chosen something that she didn't really care about losing, because the calls were more valuable. The attention was more valuable to her. So now I've put in place that I lie with her for 5 minutes. I give her lots of amazing attention. And then in the morning, she gets to come and cuddle with me in bed for 5 minutes, which is more amazing attention and one-on-one attention if there's only the one call. So, yes, I'm seeing we can totally relate. Yeah, right? Every kid does this. So, be careful with what you ask them is the reinforcer, because sometimes they're crafty enough to say, oh, I'll work for this, but that was never going to be the case. Okay, so we got some questions. These were our email questions that we got. So what can we do to start up a reinforcement system for the classroom?
So first of all, not every classroom needs a reinforcement system that's explicitly set up. So what I mean by that is sometimes I'm in a classroom and things are just jiving really well, and it's because the teacher is full of praise. And so she might say, should I put in some kind of other reinforcement system? And my answer is no, you're reinforcement.
You're already Mary Poppins.
Yeah, you're good. Yeah. Because you are so good at the thumbs up. You're so good at the winks. You're so good at the taps on the shoulder when they're doing great things that your students are feeling like they're getting lots and lots of juicy reinforcement. And if I were to take data on those situations, and sometimes I have, where I just track, in a 10-minute period, how many reinforcement statements or gestures the teacher gives to students. And I'm especially looking for the students who maybe need more reinforcement because the work's not in itself reinforcing, the book's not reinforcing. So I'm looking for how many times is that student getting other forms of reinforcement just for being there, right? And so when those teachers are the ones winking at the kiddo in the corner who's like, I hate reading, but I love being around my teacher, then I say you're good to go. In other classrooms, sometimes it gives the teacher more of a prompt, or the educators in the room more of a prompt to do the reinforcement. So sometimes it's like you need a reinforcement system where you put a piece of paper on the wall with all the names and you just check mark every time somebody raises their hand. Of course, you're focusing more on the kiddos that don't raise their hand as much to really make sure the check marks are even. That's the hard part, is not to give Marilyn 100 check marks because she's raising her hand 100 times. That's not the point of the system. The point of the system is to increase the other behavior of the other students. So sometimes that kind of thing can be important because it cues you to reinforce and it cues the students to increase their behavior. So when we were looking at dojo points, some of the research around dojo points shows that the reason why dojo points are effective is because it changes teacher behavior. Yeah, sure. Of course, it benefits students because they like getting reinforcement and it keeps it really focused reinforcement. But really, at the end of the day, it changes the teacher's level of reinforcement. So if you have more reinforcing statements than you have corrective statements, you're on a really good path, right?
Yeah.
That's what we want. We want that balance to be in that way. So, yeah.
And remember, if you are choosing to put a full class reinforcement system in, choose one thing at a time. Mm-hmm. Because you can't handle reinforcing 20 or 30 behaviors at once. You'll forget about them all. And it also you don't want it to be just for good behavior. We want to make sure that it's, okay, no one in my class puts their hand up. They all yell it all the time. Okay, that's what we're picking this week. That's what we're going to work on. Once that's solid, you put a new behavior to
because we often see in a classroom a list of classroom rules, they might have 8 rules or something on the wall and they're expecting all that all the time, or they're really inconsistently expecting some of it, right? And that's, fair enough, we're parents, we get it, right? When I'm about to go, we have a new car, so I have a no eating in the car rule, which I know is not going to last, but I've made that rule. And I also say put your seatbelt on, sit up straight, don't eat, don't drink, okay, what are we actually focusing on? Because when I'm putting too many rules in place, my kids don't really know what can they do is what they're kind of thinking. What can I do in the car, Mom? I don't know, because you've said don't do, and you've given me a list of 8 things. So we prefer to see a list of, 2 things that are positively phrased that you're working on. Raise your hand and use nice words.
And once those are solid, then you add another one. So you can eventually have more rules to your classroom, but we want to make sure that that there's 1 or 2 solid, and then you add 2.
And that they're not all worded. Don't do this. Don't do that. Don't kick. Don't swear. Don't, yell. Yeah.
So anything that you're reinforcing, we want to make sure that you're reinforcing a behavior, not the absence of. The reason for that is I am not doing 100 things right now, but not actually getting reinforced. 1,000 things I'm not doing right now, but I'm not actually getting reinforcement. What I am getting reinforcement for is doing this webinar because I'm at work, so I'm being paid, right? But I'm not kicking Jen, I'm not hitting Jen, I'm not doing all those other things as well. So want to make sure that we're actually reinforcing and giving behavior-specific praise for it. Even if praise doesn't function as a reinforcer, we want to pair that with anything. So Jen, I love how you're looking at me. Or Jen, I love how you're sitting and doing your math. Jen, I love how you opened your locker on your own today. We want to always make sure that we're labeling what they're doing because that helps the brain make that connection a little bit quicker.
Yeah. So we do have some links here from Behavior Babe. We love Behavior Babe. She's a BCBAD, so she's super smart, and she's got some really fun, cool videos on her website about reinforcement in the classroom and some top tips about reinforcement. So we're not going to reinvent the wheel. We'll just leave it to her to fill you in if you want to follow those links.
Yep. And so that ends our webinar for today, but we do plan on doing one monthly. We've posted a list of all the topics, so please go ahead and post any questions you have. If you're a little shy, feel free to email us, and it's completely anonymous. We'll just post the questions like this, because probably the questions you have are the same questions other people have, and there's no bad questions. So.
And we're hoping next time to figure out the Chromecast.
Yeah.
So sorry we were a few minutes late logging on. We just had to
figure that out.
The tech issues. Thank you so much for joining us. And we're going to post this video to the Google Plus communities so that, you know, in all your spare time, you can watch videos about ABA. I don't know.
You can increase the speed and watch us on fast mode.
There you go.
All right. Thanks for joining us, and we hope to see you next one.
Bye.
Okay. Bye.